Hey, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. I am Steven.
And I'm Daniel.
And we're going to continue our first 500-year series today. Last time we were with you, we talked about the rise of the Gnostics, talked about their doctrine, a lot of what was going on, and the currents of philosophical and theological thought in the 2nd century, and how the Gnostics contrasted with some of the writers that we'll be talking about today, which is the Christian apologists. But before we get into that, remember, leave us a comment, subscribe to the channel, give us a like, support us in any way that you can. And Dan, take it away.
Tap the bell for notifications when a new episode drops.
Right, so every time we put out an episode, you will get a notification so that you can tune in. So, without further ado, let's talk about the Christian apologists. This is a really, honestly, a very big topic, very daunting topic. Dan, you and I have...
Yeah, I think we want to just you can have a whole series just on the apologists. So I think we just wanted to give a good overview for people so that they can enter into it more deeply on their own, go into reading some of these guys, but just to kind of give some major themes for folks to think about.
Yes, perfect. So I think the best place to start is to go back to the New Testament and to Paul in Athens. So in the book of Acts, chapter 17, verse 16. So St. Paul arrives in Athens, right? He's had success among the Christian or the Gentile God-fearers in the synagogues. Well, now he's going to try his hand at the raw pagans, like the raw pagan world. So he enters Athens. He sees an altar, a dedication to an unknown god. So the Athenians were like, I guess, so polytheistic. They were like, well, whatever god we're missing out there, right? This is dedicated to the unknown. So Paul goes to the Areopagus, which is where the philosophers would gather to share the latest ideas or the latest thoughts. They'd have their public debates. There would be a lot of like rhetoricians who would show up, different schools of philosophy, literally all the time. And a lot of times these guys would be subsidized to do these very things. They'd be public spectacles in a way. And so Paul shows up, and so this is what happens. So Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects. For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and exist, as even some of your own poets have said, for we also are his children. Being then the children of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and thought of man. Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now declaring to men that all people everywhere should repent, because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has appointed, having furnished proof to all men by raising him from the dead." Now, when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some began to sneer, and others said, "We'll hear again concerning this." So Paul went out of their midst, but some men joined him and believed, among whom were also Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So what's really interesting about that is that when you're reading the book of Acts up to that point, it's just success. It's like massive conversion. Apostles put in prison, they get out, conversion. Okay, like then the persecutions stop, more conversions. And then all of a sudden you come to this point, and it's like people sneered at him. You know, some people were like, we'll hear you tomorrow about that. And then he's like, and there were a couple of people who followed him afterwards. So the point of this, to start this way, is just to say that the early apostles, they had great success among many Jews. They did. Now that success didn't last as the rabbinical movement takes steam in the 2nd century, but they had great success among the Jews. They had greater success among the Gentile God-fearers. Remember, it's these Gentiles who are sort of attached in their piety to the Jewish God and attached to synagogues in some way or another. So where they did not really penetrate much is in this philosopher class in Greco Roman society. And of course not yet out into the outskirts to the pagans themselves. But most especially to this kind of privileged class of philosophers who would have at least have the kind of subsidized lifestyle where they could travel, they could study, they could go, on a whim, they could get on a ship and go down to Egypt to study the philosophy of the Egyptians,
just like the Catholic brothers.
So they would. So the apostles didn't penetrate that class. So that part of the Christian mission was going to be left up to another generation, exactly as St. Paul said when he said, I laid a foundation and someone else is building upon it. Just don't build a foundation other than Christ, because that's what I laid down. And in a way, in our last episode with the Gnostics, it's almost as if the Gnostics are in this class, right, in this philosopher class, but to the people we're going to talk about today, it seemed as though they were trying to lay another foundation other than the one that was laid.
Yeah, that's a great point. Just hearing it afresh, you read it from St. Paul, and then some things you said, I'll make a comment on. As far as winning the Jews, it is a misnomer to say that the Christians failed at that. There's not only literary evidence to say that they didn't fail, and then, go back to our episodes on the parting of the ways and how very much close Christianity remained to its Jewish roots, tells you the success of the mission. But then also, even in archaeology, it just came into my mind too, that wherever you look in the 2nd century and into the 3rd, Christian churches are assembly halls, whatever they are, homes. They're heavily concentrated still in Jewish areas of cities throughout the empire. So it's still very much where a lot of the Christians are being made, whether they are Jews or God-fearers in that sense. So I just wanted to point that out.
That's why they were seen as a foreign superstition in some of the earliest writers.
Yeah, and one of our apologists today we'll talk about is St. Justin Martyr, who wrote a huge treatise, a dialogue with a Jew, right? Trying to fight for who is the true Israel, right? So that debate is very much going on. So I don't want folks to not to lose sight of that as we move through the 2nd century. It's just we've kind of covered that a little bit already, but that's there. And then the other thing I would say, and I'm getting ahead of myself a little, I think, but I wanted to call it out here in St. Paul. St. Paul mentions a couple things that will become two very big themes in the Apologists we'll talk about today. One is the resurrection, and two is that God is in need of nothing. Right? So even in St. Paul then, as he's approaching pagan culture, he knows what he has to hit on. Right? And he struck some chord with them. He said, well, okay, this sounds interesting, but we'll hear you another time, kind of thing. What Paul has started there is going to be picked back up here in the 2nd century with the Apologists that we'll get to today.
Yeah, and Paul is doing this at a time when really Platonism is beginning to dominate the philosophical schools. Like it's really starting to take firm root. So that when we come to the 2nd century, like we talked about in our what was it, 2 episodes ago, we were saying how the philosophical schools are almost becoming very doctrinal when it comes to Plato's philosophy and Platonism. So hence why when they hear something about like the resurrection of the dead, they would be like, oh, okay. So you're proclaiming some kind of like foreign superstition sort of thing. We're kind of more preoccupied right now with some debates about Plato. You know what I mean? Like, so come back with that later. But yeah, so all that just to say that it was up to this generation then in the second century to get beyond merely picking off the God-fearers from the synagogues, going to the Jews. It was like, no, we really need to go to the pagans, the philosophers. It's like, we know that we have divine revelation, but what about reason? Who is going to inherit reason? Because that's what the philosophers are debating about too. Is who owns reason? You know?
Yeah, I think that's another misnomer to get over. I think a lot of times we look at the earliest church and say, like the pagans were saying, oh, they're just made up of a bunch of women and children, or the poor or slaves, not to be taken serious. But the movement of the apologetic movement actually begins quite early. Aristides is one of the first ones. There's even others before him, and Aristides you can date to 138, so early second century. And we already know that Christian apologists were at work. We just don't have their works extant to us, but there were others at work even earlier in the second century. So those who live the life of the mind are clearly already a part of the Christian movement, in this nascent movement, we can still say. Early second century, like we've said before, we're only talking about several thousands of Christians throughout the empire, and they're already attracting people who live the life of the mind.
Mm-hmm. So we can go about this in a couple of ways. We can either start by kind of just listing the major players that we're talking about here, so that people know who we're going to be quoting. I think that's probably a good place to start, actually. So
so it's kind of it's simple because there's basically an apologist every decade throughout the second century, starting with Aristides in the 130s. Justin Martyr, of course, is probably the most famous one that everybody has heard of, St. Justin Martyr, in the 150s. There's Tatian, his disciple, in the 160s.
Justin's disciple.
Who unfortunately Justin's disciple, who unfortunately later we're told by Eusebius, he'll found a heretical sect. And then we have Athenagoras in the 170s. 177 is probably when he wrote his apology. Theophilus in the 180s. And then Clement of Alexandria in the 190s. We won't, I don't think, go into depth with Clement today. We'll mention him a few times, but we felt it best to leave Clement for another episode. So really, the apologists we want to speak to today and pull out some themes for you: Aristides, Justin, Tatian, Athenagoras, and Theophilus of Antioch.
Yeah, and what's kind of remarkable about them is that, like, even after you've read them, and you take in what they've said and everything, probably after like 10 minutes after finishing, everything that they've said kind of blends together. You don't even know which father wrote which thing.
That's why it's best to just come out with themes, and then everybody go.
No, that's remarkable though. It's the fact that they are so similar in a lot of ways. The one person who does stand out is Justin Martyr, for reasons that we'll talk about. So there's a reason why, if someone is vaguely familiar with the early church, they're going to remember a name like Justin Martyr, but they won't remember a name like Aristides or Theophilus or Athenagoras of Antioch, or Athenagoras of Athens. Sorry. So with that, do we want to dive into some of the themes? Just get in there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we've pulled out 7 different themes. So let's just start with the first one, which is that contra the Gnostics and contra the prevailing philosophies of their day. These guys were faithful to the Old Testament record. Like they were committed to the accuracy of the Old Testament record.
Yeah, very much so, and every single one of them that we're talking about were. And and even some of them were drawn to Christianity through the Old Testament. In fact, it's Theophilus of Antioch who tells us basically a little bit about his conversion in his work, where it was when he came upon the scriptures and was reading Moses, was reading the prophets, that he realized the true doctrine of the word, right? The Logos. And he ran with that theology into the New Testament. The apologists, not only are they very much tied to the Old Testament, but in particular, Genesis and the prophets. Yeah. Somebody like Justin Martyr, for example, in his apology, the first apology, he spends like 24 of the 50 or some odd chapters in that apology just recounting the prophecies from the prophets in defense of Christ, right? Theophilus spends all of book 2, literally all of book 2. He has 3 books that he writes. All of book 2 recounting the story of creation from Genesis, literally day by day. On day 1, this is what happened. Day 2, this is what happened. Literally recounting it all for us. But all of them altogether are quoting the Old Testament and using the Old Testament in their arguments. And of course, it's significant because it speaks to how close still Christianity is to its roots, like we suggested earlier. Christianity is not leaving its Hebrew tradition, its Second Temple tradition that we've spoke about in previous episodes, but also it's a very un-Gnostic thing, right? It's a very un-Marcion thing. The apologists are the ones who are fully embracing the Old Testament, even if it makes them uncomfortable at points.
Yeah, so that's a good point. This faithfulness to the Old Testament ties back to what we did talk about in the Marcion episode, and that was that all of the debates at the time, again, are in the philosophical schools are centered on the doctrine of creation. This whole idea that God would create the universe and not just merely fashion it. The philosophers were of their era were much more committed to the idea that matter was eternal, because a God that would create matter was like, well, that's very fickle. It's like, what is he doing, magic up there? Like, so they didn't like that idea. So the fact that these philosophers, which I actually want to comment on in a second, but these philosophers are coming forward and saying, no, look at the Old Testament record, like look at Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But then from this also, you'll get in some of them talk of the flesh itself in a way that I think that would make philosophers uncomfortable in their time.
So do you want to pull some quotes out?
Sure. Yeah.
For this. So let's see. I had one for Tatian, but we will do this one.
Sit down, Tatian.
This one is from this one's from Athenagoras, chapter 9 of his. His work is called The Plea for the Christians. He says, if we satisfied ourselves with advancing such considerations as these, our doctrines might by some be looked upon as human. But since the voices of the prophets confirm our arguments, for I think that you also, with your great zeal for knowledge and your great attainments in learning, cannot be ignorant of the writings of either Moses or of Isaiah or of Jeremiah or the other prophets, who, lifted in ecstasy above the natural operations of their minds, by the impulses of the divine Spirit, uttered the things with which they were inspired, the Spirit making use of them as a flute player breathes into a flute. What then do these men say? Quote, the Lord is our God. No other can be compared with him. End quote. And again, I am God, the first and the last, and besides me there is no God. That's Isaiah. Before me there is no other God, and after me there shall be none. I am God, and there is none besides me. Isaiah. And as to his greatness, quote, heaven is my throne, and the earth is the footstool of my feet. What house will you build for me, or what is the place of my rest? But I leave it to you, when you meet with the books themselves, to examine carefully the prophecies contained in them, that you may on fitting grounds defend us from the abuse you cast upon us. So literally presenting the books.
Yeah.
Doesn't mention the New Testament, by the way. Here's the Old Testament that speaks of us and speaks for us. You can see divine utterances. The Spirit speaks through these. The inspiration of the Old Testament is there. The prophets are speaking the words of God inspired by the Spirit as a flute player breathes into a flute. That's a beautiful little phrase that he uses.
Yeah. The big threat to the big threat to apostolic originated Christianity in the 2nd century is really what we would today call the first article of the Creed. I believe in God the Father, maker of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible. That statement alone, like, we just take it for granted, but there's a lot packed in there that you really like. Well, that's not assumed in the ancient world at all, you know.
Yeah. Can I comment? If you go to Tatian, for example, on the same topic, in chapter 5 of Tatian's work, his address to the Greeks, chapter 5, he says, God was in the beginning, but the beginning, we have been taught, is the power of the Logos. For the Lord of the universe, who is himself the necessary ground of all being, inasmuch as no creature was yet in existence, was alone. He goes on and goes on and goes on. And as the Logos, begotten in the beginning, begot in turn our world. Moving forward, goes again. For matter is not like God without beginning. So what I'm trying to point out here in this is that he keeps saying the word beginning, archon, because that was a trope for both Hebrews, for the rabbis, and for Christians. We mentioned it. I think we mentioned it with the Targums and our episodes on John. In the beginning, they were interpreting beginning as the Word himself. Like, in the beginning, God created. So in the Word, God created. And that's how St. John in his gospel interprets it. In the beginning was the Word, right? And the Word was with God. So what he's doing there is he's calling your attention, Tatian is, literally to the first words of the book of Genesis, right? Again, a commitment to creation, a commitment to the Old Testament, a commitment to the Old Testament God, because we saw that was not necessarily the case with the Gnostics or Marcionism.
Especially when it comes to the invisible realm. So not only in the material realm, but the fact that God creates the invisible realm would also be like, well, wait a minute, like, what do you mean by that? Because again, from the traditional philosophers' view, it was that God would emanate something, like something would cool or go out from God, right, and then become something different. That the whole point of which was to return to God, like to return back to where it was from. So for some philosophers, it meant that matter was infused with the Spirit of God, right? But for others, it was like, well, creation is like not with Spirit of God. It's like total corruption. Like we need to transcend this stuff and get back in spirit, to God, which is again where not only the philosophers but the Gnostics, they go in that direction. But so this is from Tatian as well. So he says, God is a spirit, not pervading matter, so like not inhabiting matter, but the maker of material spirits and of the forms that are in matter. He is invisible, impalpable, being himself the Father of both sensible and invisible things. Him we know from his creation and apprehend his invisible power by his works. I refuse to adore that workmanship which he has made for our sakes. The sun and the moon were made for us. How then can I adore my own servants? How can I speak of stocks and stones as gods? So, but again, that's not just philosopher's speech. That's because of the commitment to the Old Testament that they're speaking this
exactly.
way. It's setting the stage for much later when we talk about the language of begetting.
And I don't think the reason we call out this theme is because we can't assume that the apologists would be so loyal to the Old Testament. Right? We can look back and say, oh, it's natural for them to be, because it's easy for us to say it's natural. But in the second century, it wasn't necessarily natural to be committed to the Old Testament, especially in the face of Gnostic charges or Marcion or whomever. Right? It took a little bit of thought into how we're going to commit to the Old Testament. Right?
And
so
that commitment. Is there anything else you want to say on?
No,
so that commitment to the Old Testament, so committed to the revelation of the Old Testament gives us the doctrine of creation. Now, again, you're going to have a little bit of, it's kind of nebulous as to like, well, who is saying specifically creation out of nothing, creatio ex nihilo? You're not really sure sometimes. Like, I think you mentioned, Dan, that, you know, when you were reading like in Justin, it wasn't as clear as you'd like it to be.
Yeah. If somebody, I just didn't feel like it's super clear. It still sometimes felt like Justin believed that God, the Word, was what fashioned things. I could be wrong and just not remembering right. So if folks know of a specific explicit reference in Justin, let me know. But certainly other of these apologists, for example, like Theophilus throughout Book 2, very clearly is explaining what we would later call the doctrine of ex nihilo, that God created literally out of nothing. He stands in need of nothing because before there was creation, there was nothing. And so he stands in need of nothing. And so that leads into, there's implications for the kind of worship that we have as Christians.
Yeah. And I want people to keep this in mind from this point forward, that doctrine of creation is going to set the stage for much later when Christians are debating about who Jesus really is. Like, what is the relationship between his divine nature and his human nature? It's going to totally inform the Nicene debates and the Christological debates, because, again, like from the philosopher's point of view, anything else that exists that isn't God must have either always existed, right, or it was emanated, or on this view, it's like it was created. Okay, well, now that you have those few options, when you get to Arius of Alexandria, you know, Arius is going to be like, well, then he was created, you know, whereas others be like, no, he's an emanation in time. Well, wait a second. So you see what I mean? Like, if you kind of see the doctrine of creation, like, you got to get this right, you know, because it's going to inform a lot of the other stuff that goes on. But so they have a dogged commitment to the Old Testament record, in much the same way that the apostles themselves did. So because of that, they also become dogged defenders of the natural implication of that, which is the doctrine of the resurrection of the flesh.
Yeah, and I don't think that's one that I don't know if we would expect so much. You know, we probably mentioned this when we were talking about when we were in the first century. We're not in the first century anymore, in the second century. But in the first century, we mentioned, you know, St. Paul, and in Corinthians, he talks about the raised body will be a spiritual body. Okay, well, man, you can interpret that.
Man, he gave you everything you need.
A lot of different ways.
Get out of it.
Yeah, like you can interpret that in quite a few ways, which other non-proto-Orthodox Christians would interpret in other ways. And you had this docetic kind of tendency in the early church, and then you got this Gnostic tendency and all that stuff. So again, we can't assume that the great defenders of the Christian faith in the second century would come out in defense of the resurrection, the carnal resurrection. And it's not just a defense. It's I mean, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a pretty staunch defense of the carnal resurrection. It's not a passive or a light defense of it. I mean, they do insist on it. Every single one of these apologists do insist on it. So I'll read a little bit from Tatian here. On account of this, we believe that there will be a resurrection of bodies after the consummation of all things, not, as the Stoics affirm, according to the return of certain cycles, the same things being produced and destroyed for no useful purpose, but a resurrection once for all, when our periods of existence are completed, and in consequence solely of the constitution of things under which men alone live, for the purpose of passing judgment upon them. Nor is sentence upon us passed by Minos, before whose decease not a single soul, according to the mythic tales, was judged. But the Creator, God himself, becomes the arbiter. And although you regard us as mere triflers and babblers, it troubles us not, since we have the faith in this doctrine. For just as, not existing before I was born, I knew not who I was, and only existed in potentiality of fleshly matter, but being born, after a former state of nothingness, I have obtained through my birth a certainty of my existence. In the same way, having been born, and through death existing no longer, and seen no longer, I shall exist again, just as before I was not, but was afterwards born. Even though fire destroy all traces of my flesh, the world receives the vaporized matter, and though dispersed through rivers and seas, or torn in pieces by wild beasts, I am laid up in the storehouses of a wealthy lord. And although the poor and the godless know not what is stored up, yet God the sovereign, when he pleases, he will restore the substance that is visible to him alone to its pristine condition. So, again, it's not like, oh, we're going to be raised in a glorified spiritual body. No, it's flesh, substance. Like, God's going to reconstitute it at the end of all things in order to judge properly, right? The other thing I'll point out there is he mentions martyrs, right? Destroyed by fire. You can destroy us by fire. Ain't going to matter. I love when he says you can tear us apart by wild beasts. Ground up, as Ignatius would say, like fine wheat by the wild beasts. And Ignatius says, don't care about my body. It's going to be gone, right? In the stomachs of the beasts. But here, Tatian's saying, yeah, it doesn't matter because all that's going to be reconstituted. That material substance, wherever it is, in the ether, in the ground, anywhere in the water, God the sovereign will restore the substance.
Right.
I think it's a beautiful, beautiful sentence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's consistent theme number 2. The first one, like you said, was faithfulness to the Old Testament. If you're following us, dogged defender of the carnal resurrection is number 2.
Yeah, and again tied to creation, like you said.
Yeah,
and it's also tied to anthropology in the Apologists. We're beginning to see the beginnings of what is a Christian anthropology, where it's body, soul, and spirit, right, together. So much so that I think it is actually Tatian also. That talks about when the somebody who is damned dies, so somebody who's not a Christian, not saved, and they die, the soul itself dies too and goes away. And at the end of when the judgment comes, God will reconstitute both the body and the soul at that time. That's how tied the soul is to the body for some of these apologists. But we're beginning to see an anthropology that's going to be, again, very important when we come to the Christological debates, but also Christian anthropology as far as how St. Augustine would come to understand his own self, right, in the Confessions. And then in future centuries, understanding the human person and what that means to be a human, right? We first have to know that if we're going to define Christology in the debates, and who is Jesus as a person, as a human kind of thing. Yeah. So the beginnings of the anthropology is also here in some of these apologists.
Yeah, and there's two options. Well, there's quite a few, but there's 2 main options in their time for defining anthropology, and it's like from 2 different directions. You can either define it as mainly we're souls, and then you have like a body that's sort of trapping this, like, that like is like holding the soul. It's like a holding cell. That would be the more Gnostic approach. Actually, the Gnostics kind of took that approach with the flesh. They're like, we're really the divine spark, right? And this whole body thing, like whole goal is sort of to put that off. But then you can come from a different direction where it's like, no, we're a body that is alive, because like stones have bodies, but they're not alive. Plants have bodies, but they don't have the life we have. So it's surprising actually that the philosophers, these Christian philosophers, were able to come at it from that direction, given the temptation to go the other way.
Yeah. Let me read another one in this category for us, maybe. All right, it's Justin in his first Apology, chapter 19. And to any thoughtful person who would anything appear more credible than, if we were not in the body, and some were to say that it was possible that from a small drop of human seed, bones and sinews and flesh be formed into a shape such as we see. For let this now be said hypothetically. If you yourselves were not such as you are now, and born of such parents and causes, and one were to show you human seed, and a picture of a man, and were to say with confidence that from such a substance such a being could be produced, would you believe before you saw the actual production? No one will dare to deny that such a statement would surpass belief. In the same way, then, you are now incredulous because you have never seen a dead man rise from the dead. But as at first you would not have believed it possible that such persons could be produced from a small drop of seed, and yet now you see them thus produced in front of you, so also judge that it is not impossible that the bodies of men, after they have been dissolved, and like seeds resolved into the earth, should in God's appointed time rise again and put on incorruption. For what power worthy of God those imagine who say that each thing returns to that from which it was produced, and that beyond this not even God himself can do anything, we are unable to conceive. But this we see clearly, that they would not have believed it possible that they could have become such and produced from such materials as they now see both themselves and the whole world to be. And that it is better to believe even what is impossible to our nature and to men, than to be unbelieving like the rest of the world, we have learned. For we know that our Master Jesus Christ has said, "What is impossible with men is possible with God." And, "Fear not them that kill you, and after that can do no more, but fear him who after death is able to cast both soul and body into hell." And hell is a place where those are to be punished who have lived wickedly, and who not believe those things which God has taught us by Christ that will come to pass. Again, bones, sinews, flesh, reconstituted. God has the power to do it. Again, the reference to martyrdom, with quoting Christ there in the Gospels, even if you kill them. So obviously the apologists are doubling down. I think that's what I wanted to say earlier. They're doubling down on the carnal resurrection in the face of opposition from the philosophical world, or the Greco Roman world, who denied the physical resurrection.
Yeah, and I think subtly inside of this entire project is, I guess, what undergirds it all is the idea that man's reason can only attain to so much when it comes to reading the signs of the natural world, interacting with it with these five senses. Like, we can get far, but we can't get as far as we'd like. And so there is, with this appeal to Moses and the writings of Moses, and this appeal to what we see in the scriptures regarding creation, but then also the fact of Christ proclaiming the resurrection and Christ himself being risen from the dead, that changes how they reason. So there's this idea that, like, we need revelation to fill up what is lacking in reason. But that's not to say that reason is not something that we all have a share in any way. And that kind of takes us to our third major point that you'll see in all of them. and that is what's called logos theology. So do you want to explain a little bit about what we mean by a logos theology? I mean, obviously we know from John, right? In the beginning was the Word, the words of God. So John is sort of already playing in that pool. But these are the folks who really take that and take it to this philosophical class and draw out, like, how are we going to argue this among our peers?
Yeah, so we touched on it before in previous episodes with Philo and other early Middle Platonists, and but the Platonic idea of the Stoic idea of the logos as kind of this pervasive reason throughout the universe. The apologists are going to take that following after St. John and say that pervading reason in the universe is a being, and that being became a man,
right,
in Christ. So logos theology has its beginnings in St. John, and thank God, literally, for St. John, because this was the way not only to convert Greco Romans, philosophically minded Greco Romans, but it was also a way for them to not just enter into the gospel, but then also to explain the gospel to the rest of the Greco Roman world. And so these early apologists are running and are running with that tradition of the logos in theology, that the logos is the Word of God who became man, who is Christ, who is the Jesus of Nazareth.
Right. And stemming from that, you get Justin Martyr specifically, his idea of the logos spermaticos. Do you want to save that concept for later and run through the rest of these, and then we'll talk about Justin, or do you want to cover that now?
No, we can do it now.
Okay.
We can do it now. That's fine.
So the fact that you have God in his transcendence, you have the material world in its immanence. Well, ne'er the twain shall meet, sort of a concept. It's like, how does God then interact if he's going to be totally transcendent? How is he going to react or interact with the material world? There was this idea of the demiurge, this sort of in-between power through which God mediates whatever it is he wants to mediate to the world, and through which the world can relate to God. But that demiurge over time is more seen as the reason of God, the logos of God. And then, of course, there's all these concepts of like, well, is the logos a creature, or is it an aspect? Is it an emanation? Is it, so there's a lot of ideas on the table, and everybody's kind of, it's lively. It's a lively debate about this matter. Now, in the traditional philosophical way of talking about this, the Stoic way of talking about this is that because we all have reason, we are able to reason our way to the truth. That is the whole ground of the philosopher's way, is that we can attain to blessedness. We can do it because we have reason. So we have to reason our way to the blessed life. Justin is going to flip that a little bit, flip that paradigm a bit, because of, I would assume, because of the doctrine, the concept of grace, of God being more of a first mover rather than something that sits up there statically that we sort of work our way towards.
Right. And this is so what we're talking about is specifically Justin's doctrine of the logos spermaticos, the seminal word, which we have loved for all time, since we had first read it years ago, because it, even in our day, helps to explain. For example, you'll come up to people who come up to you and will have that kind of history of religion kind of take, like, oh, Christianity is just like naturally part of all the other religions of the world, and their ideas are just kind of reformulated and this and that, right? The doctrine of the logos spermaticos teaches that basically all truth is God's truth, and where you see glimmers and glimpses of the full revelation of the logos, well, that's because the logos has already partially revealed this to those folks. And so that's how Christians explain the history of religion. That if you see a coincidence, for example, between Horus and Christ, well, it's because the Egyptians had a glimmer of revelation about what the Christ would be, about what the Messiah would be. And those little parts of the Logos, Justin is the one who coins that term, parts of the Logos, parts of the Word, existed in other cultures throughout his world. And that's fine because it had been revealed to them by the Logos himself. So Justin, actually this comes from Justin's second apology. So there's Justin's first apology, second apology. The Logos Grammaticos is from the second apology, chapter 13, towards the end. So I'll just read the whole chapter for us. For I myself, when I discovered the wicked disguise which the evil spirits had thrown around the divine doctrines of the Christians, to turn aside others from joining them, laughed both at those who framed these falsehoods and at the disguise itself, and at popular opinion. And I confess that I both boast and with all my strength strive to be found a Christian, not because the teachings of Plato are different from those of Christ, but because they are not in all respects similar, as neither are those of the others, Stoics and poets and historians. For each man spoke well in proportion to the share he had of the spermatic word, seeing what was related to it. But they who contradict themselves on the more important points appear not to have possessed the heavenly wisdom, and the knowledge which cannot be spoken against. Whatever things were rightly said among all men are the property of us Christians. For next to God, we worship and love the Word, who is from the unbegotten and ineffable God, since also he became man for our sakes, that becoming a partaker of our sufferings, he might also bring us healing. For all the writers were able to see realities darkly through the sowing of the implanted word that was in them. For the seed and imitation impacted according to capacity is one thing, and quite another is the thing itself, of which there is the participation and imitation according to the grace which is from him. So two things there at the end, right? These other writers, and the poets, philosophers, they saw realities and truths darkly by the sowing of the implanted word. There is an action, he's saying. There is an action that was taken, an intervention that was taken by the word, having to implant something in them. And then he says it in another way, in a different way at the end. Participation and imitation according to the grace which is from him. So again, the grace given to the poets and the philosophers to at least say something reasonable, uppercase reasonable, something reasonable, something worthy of the Logos, of truth itself.
And again, I think that's yet another another implication of their commitment to the doctrine of creation. Because if you think about it from the perspective of their non-Christian peers, matter exists either by a falling away from God, like a falling, a cooling, or whatever, a going out from the divine, or it exists eternally. It's always been there, and it's merely been fashioned. So it's not a revelation, and it's not a source of like revelation in a way. We can use it to reason certain things about God, but see, this is when you say that the material world is created by God from his mind, then that means that creation itself is a revelation. And so everything that we interact with that forms our reason, from our interaction of these five senses with the material world around us, is the basis upon which we reason. Well, then you can't say that God's not the first actor in this drama, right? Like in the entire narrative.
Yeah. Yeah, and to add to kind of this developing Christology, or this Logos theology that we're talking about, Theophilus in Book 2, when he's discussing creation ex nihilo, he speaks of the Word as being always within the Father, right? Always within the Creator. But he distinguishes between that and then he says the uttered word. And the uttered word is what we would say is the unbegotten. So in other words, how was the word, how did the word come to be, or how was he born, right? The Christians say he's unbegotten of the begotten. He's begotten of the unbegotten, I should say. He's begotten of the unbegotten. And Theophilus explains that by saying, once the word that was internal to the Father through all eternity is uttered, then we speak of him as begotten. So again, the apologists are using the logos theology. They're wrestling with the idea of Trinity, even for the first time. In fact, it is Theophilus who is the first one on record to use the word Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, in reference to the divine Trinity. It's not actually Tertullian; it's Theophilus. But kind of back to Justin. So among all these people, the truths that they spoke actually belongs to us. He says, right? It actually belongs to the Christians, and the poets and the philosophers, they learned this. They were imparted this knowledge by the Word Himself.
Right, and that takes us actually right back to Mars, or to the Areopagus, when Paul is saying to them that we would grope after him, like try to find him in the darkness. In a way, it's like he's describing in that. They didn't appreciate it at the time, but, well, they're going to appreciate it later because Christianity's going to explode. But, at the time when Paul's saying that, he's ahead of his time in a way, because he's saying, like, that right there, that analogy I just gave you, is the philosopher's pursuit. You think that by just, I just got to keep evaluating all the ideas that are out there, living these different lives. So I do want to emphasize that in a second, but, like, live these different ways, and then find the truth. Like, we'll get there. And Paul, like, heads him off at the pass in his speech, saying that, like, you're not going to make it. You're only going to make it a certain distance. But there has to be this act, this revelation where God fills in what it is that you have lacking. But see, what Justin is saying is that even the groping in the dark is an act of God on them. Like Justin says that philosophy comes to us from God. So philosophy itself is a way, is a means of revelation. See, like, the philosophers would see it as like, oh, well, I have my reason, and that's my means of getting to the divine. But what Justin is saying is that, no, you have reason, you have a part of reason, and that is God's means of getting to you.
Yeah.
So it's a paradigm shift that Justin is actually introducing. Even though he's speaking the language of the philosophers in this kind of logos theology, he's flipping the paradigm.
He's speaking the language of the Stoics, yeah. And he's wrapping it in a kind of a Middle Platonic interpretation, which it is unique to Justin. And we should say, of all the apologists that we're speaking of, Justin is certainly the most original thinker, the most profound thinker when it comes to...
Also the most Christo-focused.
Yeah. So that we're on Justin, we should probably say that, yeah. Certainly the most Christocentric of all of them. I mean, you can go through and read all of the treatises of these philosophers, and you'll notice that there's not much mention of Jesus, right, in all of this. Where's Jesus? Like, you could come away and say, where's Jesus in all this, basically? And you'd be right in saying that, right, because he doesn't appear much. It's more the words mentioned and all that stuff, right? You have to know the audience that these apologists are speaking to, of course, as well. But Justin is all the time speaking of Jesus, all the time speaking of the Word became flesh in Jesus, our Savior. So very, very grounded in the incarnation is Justin.
Even when they talk about the apostles and their mission, Paul himself says, like, I didn't come to you with, like, convincing words of speech. I came to you with a demonstration of power. Okay. It's funny because when you read, I think it's Aristides who says, he talks about the mission of the apostles, and he says, and they went out into all the world in virtue and self-control, and people and people were astounded by them. Like, wait, you're not going to mention that they like raise people from the dead and like things like that. So you can see that they're kind of you don't know how much of it is like you said, their audience that they're trying to speak to, and they don't want to ruin what they're about to say, but or if it's really right. That's what they themselves are just interested in. That's what they're focused on because they're living this philosophic life. And on that point, I think now's the time to say, I've been saying it over and over, that I'll get to it. But one trap that I don't want any of us to fall into when we talk about the fathers, especially these guys, is when we say, for instance, Justin's philosophy, right? Or someone's philosophy, or like Irenaeus's theology. We have to be careful with the words theology and philosophy, because in the 2nd century, those words mean something just completely different. Especially the word philosophia. Like, I mean,
completely different.
Like, the way that we use philosophy, we think of it as like, a department of the humanities where you have debates and like it's like a mind game. Like, in the 2nd century, in this whole era of late antiquity, philosophy primarily is a way of being, like a way of living. And the goal is blessedness. Happiness. I mean, Jesus literally, when he said like, happy are those who, or blessed are those who, like, that's the same concept, is like, how do we get to blessedness? So,
and how, and there's a threat. How are all of these apologists using that term? Right. There's a thread between them.
Yes. Well, the fact that like their whole, I mean, I think I know what you're getting at, but their Christianity is
how they would define Christianity.
Yes, is how you get to blessedness is Christianity. So for them, don't think of them as like, oh, these are the early Christian writers, or like these are the fathers of the church. We need to think of these apologists as men who were living the philosophic life, and they stumbled upon Christianity, and they said, this is it. This is the blessed life. And so this fills in all those gaps that Plato had. It fills in all the gaps that Moses had. It fills in, the philosophy of the Jews and the philosophy of the Greeks and the Romans. This is it. So now we have to turn back to them and show them how they are incomplete and need to be completed by this. Whereas when you're looking at someone like the Gnostics, their disposition was, they're heavy into myth, they're heavy into Plato, and then they stumble upon Christianity and they're like, oh, Christianity, some of these elements of Christianity can fill in the gaps of our Platonism, of our myths, or these kinds of things. So it's the complete opposite. So we need to see these men as truly as philosophers, truly, and not like, oh, hey, here's the mind experiment, so let's go through our syllogisms. It's like, no, these are men who are trying to find out the blessed life. Like Justin tells us too that like he, or actually it's Eusebius, I think, talking about Justin. Remind me, Dan, but he wore the philosopher's garb every day of his life. He identified himself in public as a philosopher, as someone who is living the blessed life.
Yeah, and that's why you hear from a number of them that we're covering that they were travelers. They traveled the world in search of the true philosophy. I'll read Tatian, his closing statement in his treatise. He says, to sum up, "These things, O Greeks, I, Tatian, a disciple of a barbarian philosophy, have composed for you." So he's kind of I composed this whole treatise, but I'm a barbarian, Barbarian philosophy. I've composed it for you. I was born in the land of the Assyrians, having been first instructed in your doctrines, and afterwards in those which I now undertake to proclaim. Henceforward, knowing who God is and what his work is, I present myself to you prepared for an examination concerning my doctrines, while I adhere immovably to that mode of life which is according to God.
Bingo. And it's important to note that like this is the reason why some writers that most people would consider among the apologists, people like an Irenaeus, you know, or like a Hippolytus or any of these other writers that were defending Christianity, like we're defending apostolic doctrine, therefore apologists. No, when we talk about the apologists, it's these people who were willing to use the word philosophia in a positive sense about Christianity. Whereas
that's what I was trying to get at.
Yeah, so like whereas people like Irenaeus or Hippolytus or even a Tertullian will use the word philosophy in a pejorative way to talk about what the Greco Roman world is up to, like what they do. So they're more focused on explaining Christian teaching, like explaining Christian doctrine, explaining the revelation. Whereas these guys are more like wearing the title of philosophia as a badge of honor for Christianity and saying that this is the blessed life. This is the way.
Nice.
Cool, dude. Okay, so from logos theology though, there's another aspect that it's kind of the flip side of the coin that ties these people together. So far, just to recap, we have faithful to the Old Testament record, doggedly defend the carnal resurrection. This whole
doggedly, that's a good word. I said
dogged.
double down, but doggedly is better. Yeah, doggedly defend. Yeah,
dogged's good.
Nice job.
And then we have the logos theology. So now what we have to do is the flip side of that coin is a heavy emphasis on the transcendence of God as good philosophers. But all of them will talk about how God is ineffable. He is impassible. He is invisible. We're not.
I'm ready for it.
Not able to apprehend him. All those things. So let's get some quotes.
Okay.
Whenever you're ready, Dan.
Yeah. Trying to find all these quotes at once. All right.
I'm gonna get you bookmarks next birthday.
I wrote down Athenagoras 15, so I hope this is right. Oh gosh. All right, but grant that they acknowledge the same. All right, because the multitude who cannot distinguish between matter and God, or see how great is the interval which lies between them, they pray to idols made of matter. Are we therefore who do distinguish and separate the uncreated and the created, that which is and that which is not, that which is apprehended by the understanding and that which is perceived by the senses, and who give the fitting name to each of them? Are we to come and worship images? If indeed matter and God are the same, two names for one thing, then certainly, in not regarding stocks and stones, gold and silver as gods, we are guilty of impiety. But if they are at the greatest possible remove from one another, as far asunder as the artist and the materials of his art, why are we called to account? For as is the potter and the clay, matter being the clay and the artist the potter, so is God, the framer of the world, and matter, which is subservient to him for the purposes of his art. But as the clay cannot become vessels of itself without art, so neither did matter, which is capable of taking all forms, receive, apart from God the framer, distinction and shape and order. And as we do not hold the pottery of more worth than him who made it, nor the vessels of glass and gold than him who wrought, but if there is anything about them elegant in art, we praise the artificer, and it is he who reaps the glory of the vessels. And even so with matter and God, the glory and honor of the orderly arrangement of the world belongs of right not to matter, but to God, the framer of matter. So that if we were to regard the various forms of matter as gods, we should seem to be without any sense of the true God, because we should be putting the things which are dissoluble and perishable on a level which that is eternal. So you see throughout the Apologists a lot of stuff like that. God can only be apprehended partially, slightly by the senses, can't be apprehended by physical things and the arts and those types of by making idols, basically, is what he's referring to here. You see that throughout. Over to you, Steve.
Nah, we're done. That was good. Yeah,
so it's a holy transcendent. God is wholly other. It's a transcendent God that we're speaking of and encountering here in the Apologists.
Exactly, and doing that. Not to rag on him right now. So we'll do that later. But there's a danger in that too. It's a balancing act. It always is, between God's immanence and transcendence with Christianity, because we have the fact of God being wholly other, truly, but then we also have this fact of God becoming man, and so we have to wrestle with this idea of God being, imminently near to us, but then like so transcendent that we can't even comprehend him. In fact, don't even say anything positive about him. We can only make negations. Right. That's very difficult to balance, and I would say that they, with the exception maybe of Justin Martyr, lean more towards the transcendence of God, and to emphasize that. And downstream, it's going to cause a prevailing I don't want to say dogged, Dan. I'm missing the word, but there's going to be a prevailing or a subtle subordinationism when it comes to Jesus. And I'm not talking about subordinationism in terms of like in the days of his flesh, but in his divine nature, that somehow the Logos that we're talking about is subordinate to God, to the Father. Right. And that's going to be something that the church is going to work through down the road. But right. it starts sort of here, because they're
and again, it's the audience, right? One thread that runs through all of this is that the apologists are trying to show God's transcendence and his unity, and they're bringing in poets and philosophers who have also talked about God's transcendence and his unity. So in other words, why are you persecuting us, the Christians, as atheists, when we're just saying what the philosophers themselves have said, that there is the one who is ineffable and incomprehensible, and all those types of things. Let me read Aristides. I found a better one maybe for you, Steve. Aristides in chapter 1. I say then that God is not born, not made, an ever-abiding nature without beginning, without end, immortal, perfect, incomprehensible. Now when I say that he is perfect, this means that there is not in him any defect, and he is not in need of anything, but all things are in need of him. And when I say that he is without beginning, this means that everything which has beginning has also an end, and that which has an end may be brought to an end. He has no name, for everything which has a name is kindred to things created. Form he has none, nor yet any union of members, for whosoever possesses these is kindred to things fashioned. He is neither male nor female. The heavens do not limit him, but the heavens and all things visible and invisible receive their bounds from him. Adversary he has none, for there exists not any stronger than he. Wrath and indignation he possesses not, for there is nothing which is able to stand against him. Ignorance and forgetfulness are not in his nature, for he is altogether wisdom and understanding, and in him stands fast all that exists. He requires not sacrifice and libation, nor even one of the things invisible. He requires not anything from anybody, but all living things and creatures stand in need of him. So you can read that and say, oh yeah, that's what the New Testament or the Old Testament says. You have to kind of interpret the Old Testament to say that, right? To say that God doesn't get angry or that God doesn't forget, right? We know the verses we're talking about in the Old Testament, right? So Aristides and the other philosophers, Christian philosophers, are positing a fully transcendent being.
The philosopher's God.
Incomprehensible being.
Yeah. They're holding on to the philosopher's God, but they're now explaining how the philosopher's God becomes an incarnated Jesus in Galilee.
Right. Not an easy task.
No, and actually, I think Judaism had its own struggles with the immanence and transcendence of God as well, because you have the rhetoric of the prophets that says like, well, God doesn't dwell in temples. And you're like, well, Does he though? Because he kind of did, like
Yeah.
in the text, like
Yep.
like the
Yeah.
the glory.
But again, yeah, and that's one. So we said that this type of language is fine, and we believe it too now, but it needs to be explained and nuanced, right? It will lead to debates, and they're trying to. You have to understand that these early apologists are trying to understand fully the relationship between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, right? At this stage in the 2nd century, there are some who make the distinction. I said earlier, Theophilus even uses the word Trinity, right, for the three. There are others in this stage in Christian history where the Spirit and the Logos are kind of the same. Others are modalistic, right, that God has shown up in different modes. That, by the way, is not Justin. Justin does not fall into modalism when he speaks of, the Father, the Word,
Right.
the Son. So again, there's a developing that's going on here, and the apologists, there's a pro and con, or a dark side to this coin that can be there as well, that the church will have to think through.
Yeah.
The other side to it I was going to get to is what you alluded to, and that is there is also the tendency among some of these Christian philosophers to rationalize or spiritualize the cult, right? To say that since God is wholly other, wholly transcendent, he stands in need of nothing. We don't offer sacrifices. We don't offer libations. Well, that's fine and good, and that's true. But in the other side of your mouth, we're saying we offer the Eucharist,
Yeah.
right? So but it's a nuanced way of, they have to now explain how the Eucharist is different from other sacrifices, even though it is a sacrifice kind of thing. So again, we're developing through the 2nd century, and things will become clearer as we move, obviously, into the 3rd and 4th and 5th.
Yeah. Here's the thing, folks. We've got what ties, just like when we look at like what ties these Old Testament texts together, like what ties Ruth to Ecclesiastes to Isaiah to the Pentateuch. It's not the texts themselves, because they're very different texts. There's something else that says, yes, these texts belong together. It's some kind of a narrative. It's some and a community that can look at it and say, these are the texts that belong, right? In a kind of a similar way, we tend to look at like the fathers of the church, and we look at them as just like this big block of faithfulness, and like, and they're all on the same page. It's like we have to, okay, for instance, what ties like Ratzinger, like in modern, Catholicism, like what ties Ratzinger to, like, I don't know, Bishop Barron, or like those are two very different types of people, with different emphases. They're sharing the same faith, and they're sharing in the same cult and the practice of Christian religion, but they're very different. Well, it's the same thing here. Like when you're looking at these apologists, it's funny that almost invariably they all occupy the same quote unquote office or position in the church, and that's the position of didaskalos, teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at someone like an Irenaeus, an Ignatius of Antioch, Hippolytus, these folks are bishops. They're pastors of flocks. And so their idea of teaching the Christian faith, again, like I said, alluded to before, is that they're explaining the doctrine. They're explaining the revelation, the thing that happened, and what it means for us. And their idea of Christianity is like, how do I attain to salvation? These guys, these apologists, are, again, much more focused on how do I attain to blessedness, to the blessed life. Now, those two things aren't contradictory, but they're different. They are distinct. So when we're talking about these guys, we also have to understand that there are going to be, just as in the 12th century or the 13th century or the 16th century has their own great things, like those are all good guys, but they also have their blind spots. That doesn't get suspended when we come to the patristic era. You're going to see century over century, you have progress being made on questions of Christian theology, but then you're also going to have these like blind spots of their age. They are still men of their time. And it's no less so when we come to these apologists. They are men of their time. So when we're talking about how like I just don't want people to listen to this and be like, holy cow, like that's not right theology. Like these are fathers, like, well, yes, but this is Justin, like this is Tatian, this guy over here is Irenaeus. Like they're coming from different perspectives and they're accomplishing different things. So this whole emphasis on the transcendence of God, like you're saying, Dan, is going to have implications for how they practice their religion that is going to look a little bit different than how, say, the common Joe, the local tanner who's going to, the martyrs' shrine down the street, to to ask for prayers or something. That's going to look very different than how a Justin Martyr or a Tatian or someone else is doing the outward practice of it, and especially someone like a Clement of Alexandria.
And it may not. I mean, all we have is their writings, right? So
we do have okay. So I guess I'm getting ahead of myself because I'm mainly thinking about like someone like Origen of Alexandria who says certain things about the outward practice of the cult.
Right.
Like, well, so what we do know is that like he's saying, oh yeah, so God doesn't stand in need of offerings. He doesn't stand in need of these things. Well, because he's talking their language of the philosopher's God. But meanwhile, when Justin goes to worship, what is he talking about? Well, they bring forward the bread and wine, and we're taught that this is his flesh. Okay,
right. Well, that's why I'm saying that all the philosophers are talking about the transcendence of God, and he stands in need of no sacrifice or life. Justin is the one who then, very oddly, actually, at the end of his first apology, goes into the sacraments,
right? Baptism
and Eucharist, which is we can save for a different episode we've talked about before.
Yeah.
But
well, this
is a point. He does go back to the cult of the Christians and their worship.
Yeah, and this has direct ties also to our other video that we did in response to Gavin Ortland. I'll just mention this in passing, but like even with the whole idea of painting images, in the churches and all this kind of stuff, it's like these are the types of passages that a Protestant apologist will grab and say, see, like we wouldn't like, because they're saying things like we wouldn't think of making an image of the divine, or we wouldn't think of or making any images, or you're like, do you now kind of see the context of these statements? They're speaking to philosophers. In fact, the very title of their works, I mean, you look at Justin, right? He's writing a title.
It's to the Greeks.
Yeah. And also an apologia, an apology.
Yeah.
So like when we talk about like that genre, okay, so
what genre? Yeah, the genre.
The genre of writing is strictly philosophical, because an apology, immediately what you think of is Socrates. Like Socrates' apology. An apology, for those those who don't know, is a defense, a public defense. Like calling, it's almost like,
I guess we should have defined that in the beginning.
Right, yeah.
What does apology mean? But these guys just wrote a bunch. We're sorry, Romans, please don't persecute us. We're so sorry,
dude. But there's something so poetic about this, that they chose this genre to do it. Not only because they are philosophers, but also or they see themselves philosophers and living a philosopher's life, but also because they're currently on trial. Like Christians are being brought to trial. Well, an apologia is something that you give at your trial.
Well, and let me interject there. That's why when you're reading these specific folks, you'll see that one of the common things they're trying to combat, actually, it's not one of our main themes, but one of the things they're combating is that Christians are judged unjustly just for being Christian, just for having the name Christian. Theophilus mentions it. Athenagoras mentions it. Justin begins his whole address to the Greeks with the same exact thing, that we are judged falsely just for being Christians. Well, that's unjust. Well, that fits into this genre. Why? Because Socrates was judged unjustly. Right. So we now are being judged unjustly, and so we will offer our apologia.
Yes, exactly. So they're staging the entire writing itself as if they're already on trial. Like this is a court case, and I'm explaining to you, good emperor, or whoever they're writing to, right? Or governor. Like, I'm explaining to you already in anticipation of being put on trial. I'm explaining to you our philosophia. This is what we're actually up to.
Yep. Yeah. So a very different, a very unique, specific audience that this is being written to. We have to keep the context in mind. Really quick, are we leaving this? I don't want to leave this before we say transcendence of God and his unity.
Mm-hmm.
That God is one. And a theme throughout all of these apologists, whether you're reading Aristides in the 130s or all the way through to Theophilus and Athenagoras in the 170s and 180s, God is one. And all of them quote up and down their treatises the ancient poets and philosophers of the Greeks and the Romans, who also said that God is one. And not just, the easy ones like Socrates or Plato, who are talking about the transcendent one and the all one being, but the poets as well. Mm-hmm. Homer, Hesiod, the early poets of Greco Roman religion, actually the guys who invented the gods, they too also admitted to the one God. Orpheus shows up all the time. The myth of Orpheus. Orpheus is like this mythical person, godlike person in Greek mythology, who many Greeks and Romans thought actually existed, and he may have. But he was a poet and a musician who wrote these grand poems about the gods, right? And consistently throughout these treatises, you'll see reference to Orpheus, the player, the poet who plays on his lyre, and he writes these beautiful poems about the gods. He himself talks about the one God, right? And so the Christians are saying, hey, look at your own people are saying these things. What's interesting about the Orpheus reference that shows up a few times in these writers is that it also shows up multiple times painted on the ceilings of the catacombs, the Christian catacombs. Not just on the ceilings of Christian catacombs, but also on sarcophagi that have been found throughout the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. It seems that Orpheus must have been this kind of prized figure that Christians adopted that represented Christ. Right. Somebody who could, with their wisdom and their poetry, subdue, in Orpheus's case, subdue nature and subdue animals. But I think it's Clement of Alexandria, actually, who we're not going to get to today, but it's actually Clement of Alexandria who says that Christ is the new Orpheus who subdues the worst kind of animal, that is man. So that motif of Orpheus is actually not just found in the writings of the Apologists, but on the walls of the catacombs as well. There. So there's this overall attempt by the Apologists, no matter who you're reading, to say that, look, hey, you Romans, look at Orpheus's writings of the one God. Look at the Sibylline books. So, go to the Sibyl. Look at the Sibylline books, and there you'll find that the Sibyl, the prophetesses of your own culture, have said that there is one God.
Gosh, we can get off on a tangent on this one, but it also recalls back to our prophets episode, where we talked about how even the Hebrew prophets would conduct their prophecies in song form and sing them. Mm-hmm. So if you think about that, like they knew that, like they knew that, like in the ancient world, like music was a means by which you prophesied or revealed divine truths or spoke them. Mm-hmm. So if you look at somebody like, one of these apologists, these Christian philosophers, they look and they see, look, I look at the Jews, okay, and I see the figure of the prophet speaking the oracles of God, and then I see the people, the mass of people who rightly or wrongly are worshiping. It's like, and the prophet is sort of the one correcting, and all of it, stepping back from both of those, it's like, and all of it is incomplete. It needs Christ. Then they look over at their own culture that they're coming from. They see the philosopher. Some of these folks who, even like you're saying, like this figure of Orpheus, where like that's the oracles. Like these are the people who are who receive philosophy from God, receive divine light from God. Then you have the mass of people, who are worshiping this, worshiping the idols and offerings and all that stuff in the temples, and so you can kind of see how they can see like that's incomplete, like that's not there. They're worshiping the wrong God, right? But the philosophers got it right. They have this God who's totally transcendent and the unity of God, So that's why they see increasingly. This brings us to our fifth point that pervades the apologists, and that is the idea of Christians as what they call a third race. And by race, our word for race is like ethnic. Like they're not talking ethnicity. Races for them was people who participate in a certain cult of religion, the practice of a religion. So they would say, look, you have the Greeks and the Romans, as one race. You have the Jews as another race. But we Christians constitute a third race.
Yeah. So Aristides, his whole treatise is based around that. He calls Christians the fourth race because he says there's barbarians, there's Greeks, and then there's Jews. And each have gone astray, in their own way, really. And the Christians are this new race. So for the barbarians, he's the one who says they worship nature. So anybody who worships nature are barbarians. So that would be the Egyptians. Sorry, guys. The Egyptians are going to get it. The Greeks are the ones who worship idols, dead idols. So they're wrong. And then interestingly, he says the Jews have some of the truth or whatever, but they have gone astray also because they went on to worship their laws and the angels, which, by the way, kind of harkens back to some of the work we've done on the powers in heaven episodes, and divine council episodes we had. That there were Second Temple Jews who showed honor, veneration, worship to angels. And so you see it here, Aristides actually charging Jews, overall Jews, with that charge that they worship angels. But the Christians alone worship the one true God.
And worship him aright.
He even has a great he even has a great section where he kind of predicts what a pagan might say back to him, a pagan philosopher might say back to him. Maybe I'll read that and we kind of pull from that. So here he's talking about the Greeks who have erred in idol worship. He says, further, their writers and their philosophers represent and declare that the nature of all their gods is one. So it's like, so I should say the other apologists say, yeah, your philosophers say God is one, so listen to them, right? Why aren't you listening to what they said? Because that's clearly what should be said. Aristides, even though he's the earliest of the apologists, he's actually anticipating what would be said back. So that's kind of lets us know that this debate has been ongoing. He's been here, it didn't just start in the mid-second. It's been ongoing, and he's heard things back and forth. So, sorry. Anyway, the philosophers declare the nature of all their gods is one, and they have not apprehended God our Lord, who, while he is one, is in all. They err, therefore. For if the body of a man, while it is many in its parts, is not in dread, one member of another, but since it is united body, wholly agrees with itself. Even so also God is one in his nature. A single essence is proper to him, since he is uniform in his nature and his essence, and he is not afraid of himself. If then the nature of the gods is one, as the philosophers say, it is not proper that a god should either pursue or slay or harm a god. If then gods be pursued and wounded by gods, and some be kidnapped and some struck dead by lightning, it is obvious that the nature of their gods is not one. And hence it is known, O king, speaking to the emperor, that it is a mistake when they reckon and bring the natures of their gods under a single nature. If then it becomes us to admire a God which is seen and does not see, how much more praiseworthy is it that one should believe in a nature which is invisible and all-seeing? And if further, it is fitting that one should approve the handiworks of a craftsman, how much more is it fitting that one should glorify the creator of the craftsman? So he kind of, gets ahead of, and anticipates what they'd say back. Oh, but God is one, kind of thing. But he's saying, yeah, but go further. Your gods are all fighting with each other and are fickle, and they're immoral, and they're contradictory, right? That's another theme that runs through all of this. When the apologists are speaking of the gods, they're pointing out that they're not living in accordance with the virtuous life, with the blessed life. So why should I pay any attention to them anyway?
Right.
Kind of thing, right? And God, you're saying God is one, but God can't be one, because you're saying that God is in all the gods, yet all these gods are fighting each other. Let me show you the one true God who is consistent with himself, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Right. I wonder what they said back.
I know. I wish I had that response. but so that's and you can find in Justin too. So in the treatise that we assigned to Justin, his address to the Greeks, the gods are fickle, immoral, contradictory, right? But that God is one, right? Those are all themes that run through the apologists.
Not to belabor the point, but I just want to call us back to that. Like this ties back to that idea of seeing, like, from the Christian perspective, it is important that when they're talking about themselves as this third race, because
or fourth race,
yeah, because you do see the parallels where the way that the mass of Jews, like, of the old covenant, like, perceived of God and wrote about God was that, he's fickle, he was this, he was that, right? And you can even hear, like, how Marcion would come in with something like that, but the prophets don't speak that way about God. So it's like they had an insight, right? And these ones here, they had the right God but the wrong worship. Okay, now I'm turning over here. The philosophers have right God, right? But then the mass of people have the wrong worship. And they talk about the gods in this fickle way, but then the philosophers are talking about God in this very sophisticated way. You could say, like over here, the philosophers are like, God doesn't live in temples. He doesn't stand in need of anything, right? Well, that's what the prophets are saying, like, to the Jews. So you can see how they would get this idea that, like, God spoke to both. Like, God reached down to both. Obviously, Jews were a little bit further ahead because they really did have the right God. But you could see why they would say, okay, both y'all need Jesus.
Yeah, both y'all. Yeah, both y'all. Yeah, Jesus is the glue. Yeah, Jesus is the glue that brings it all together. So it's not just Aristides who talks about the Christians as a new race, but it's also the letter to Diognetus, which we did not include in this episode because it's not really a philosophical text. It's a beautiful text, one of the most beautiful, and in fact, one of the most well-written texts of the early church. So whoever wrote this got it exactly right linguistically. So a beautiful text, and just a great exposition of the Christian faith. It is a defense. It is somewhat of an apology, but it doesn't fit in this philosophical circle, and we don't know how to date it. It might be late first century, could be second century, could be third century. So we kind of left it out, but that is another document of the time, bringing forth the idea that Christians are a new people. Yeah. Now, the apologists have to be careful when they say that, because of course the great charge of the Romans against the Christians was that you're new. So yes, we are another race, not necessarily a new race. We are another race with deep roots, ancient roots is kind of what the apologists are hoping to accomplish.
Oh, they're in a tight spot, man, because they have to, on the one hand, find a way to distinguish themselves from the Jews, but on the other hand, have to tie themselves to the Jews so that they have the antiquity. So they're
exactly. Exactly.
Because that's actually one of the standards by which the philosophers would judge other ideas as well. It's like, how old is this? And Romans in general, they just venerated antiquity, which is why the Jews, because they sort of carved out a little island for the Jews to practice their cult.
They had no choice. They had to admit its antiquity, which is why, again, we mentioned it, one of the themes, faithful to the Old Testament. the Christians are faithful to the revelation of antiquity.
So that's how Christians get around this, is they say, well, look, we're the proper heirs of Revelation. We're the proper heirs of the Old Testament. The Jews have mishandled it. So we're the ones who are now inheriting that, and in the practice of our religion, we constitute a third or fourth people, a third or fourth race. But it's not because we're new. It's actually because we are the oldest, and you guys have fallen away from that. And that's actually, that brings us to our sixth point, that runs through all.
Oh, it does?
It sort of does. It runs through all the apologists, and it's crafting the narrative of history as a falling away from belief in the true God to the worship of false gods, which then these demonic powers co-opted to shackle pagan culture to themselves up to this point. And so the liberation in Jesus for these folks is to be freed from all of that, to be freed from the shackles of ignorance to which they've descended.
Yeah, and this plays big in Justin, right? Because we said that Justin's originality is that the Logos Spermaticos has imparted some parts of knowledge into even the philosophers and the Greeks and the Romans, and that's why he refers actually to baptism as an illumination, because when we accept Christ, when Christ becomes our Lord and Savior, right, and we're baptized and illumined by Him, by the Word, the demons have no longer any say over us. And so it's not just about receiving imparted knowledge or receiving something. It's also that Jesus takes away and subdues the demons who misrepresent that truth that's imparted to us. And that's exactly the history of culture that the apologists are teaching, is that the demons are behind your culture. The demons are behind your gods.
Right.
And they've been tricking you all this time.
Right.
And so when Jesus comes, he not only reveals fully the truth, he himself being that truth, but also takes care of the demons and gets rid of them, right? Through baptism, through the exorcist rites that are done in baptism, that no longer can they affect your mind, right?
Yeah.
I think it's important point. Sorry, I had to go on a rant.
Well, that's going to be the foundation that is set for something as magnificent as Augustine's City of God, because again, they're fighting a hard battle because they have to tie themselves to Jews, but they also have to separate themselves from Judaism. And so when they do that, whenever they're going in the separation route and distinguishing themselves, again, like you said, the charge of novelty comes out. Well, then really what we have to do as Christians is we have to give an account for history. Like why late in time behold him come? Why did he wait so long to come? Why didn't he just come right when people were falling away? So there has to be some kind of how do I make sense of the fact that you have creation over here, the fall of man here, and then Jesus comes to bring us back. The accounting of history, and I think demonology just becomes that. And I don't mean that in a flippant way. I mean it honestly is they're like, well, yeah, the demons, duh. Like that's how you make sense of it, because they
right.
held us in captivity,
Right.
So what we're getting is also an account of history for the first time, a Christian account of human history, and they're laying the groundwork of that someone like St. Augustine later will really pick up on with his great work, City of God, which previous to him was the Donatist writer Tychonius, who wrote an account of Christian history. So that's going to be something that you'll see as a theme as well, as Christians trying to make sense of history through this prism.
Yeah, and So just a quick example, and you can find this sentence could have been any of them, but it's in Justin. Justin, First Apology, chapter 9. And neither do we honor with many sacrifices and garlands of flowers such deities as men have formed and set in shrines and have called gods, since we see that these are soulless and dead, and have not the form of God. For we do not consider that God has such a form as some say that they imitate to his honor, but have the names and the forms of those wicked demons which have appeared. For why need we tell you who already know into what forms the craftsman, carving and cutting, casting, hammering, fashioning the materials, blah, blah, all that stuff. So all throughout, demons are behind these idols. And in fact, you'll see the philosophers say that the Christians or the pagans themselves have admitted that demons have spoke through their statues and have spoken through their idols. I can't recall which apologist that's in. Gosh, if I can find it, I'm going to read it, but it's in there, where demons are actually behind some of the prophecies that have come from, say, the Sibyl, and he says that, well, you guys admit that has happened before, So yeah, a very effective way for Christians to describe, in tandem with Logos Grammaticos, effective way to describe the history of culture, and what has happened before Christ, up to Christ.
Good, yeah. So that's our that's. Oh, go ahead.
No, there's another one.
Then
the last theme.
What's the last theme?
Christian religion predates the poets.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I thought we already covered that. That's why. Oh, gotcha.
We kind of did. Yeah, we kind of did. We did, folks.
So,
but not only a predate, but in Justin and then in Justin's disciple Tatian, you'll find that the philosophers actually learned of God, the one true God, through Moses, through reading of Moses. And, so for example, when Plato visits Egypt, it's there where he read the Old Testament scriptures and learned of God and stuff. So again, there's a reason why Justin must say that, right? Because of this idea of the imparted logos into the philosophers. And so they've received some revelation and grace.
However, that's not totally far-fetched either at the same time. Cool. I mean, because, we've talked about this before, though, where we said that, like, we tend to see ancient Greece as the beginning of Western culture, when it's really the last of the great Near Eastern cultures. So the religion of the Hebrews, like the ancient Hebrews and stuff, does predate, classical Greece. So it's from there that, whatever the legends or the stories are about, Plato's travels or whatever it is, the really high level fact is that, yes, Hebrews, the Hebrew religion predates whatever was happening in classical Greece.
That's true. And with this history of culture that we're talking about with the Logos Grammaticos, Christianity, you could say, becomes kind of the vantage point now from which to judge all truth, from which to judge all cultures through time, right? And that's how we approach it to this day. The other thing I'll say is that how effective was this, right? Because that is true. The revelation to the Hebrews does predate the Greeks and the Romans. Right. And the Christian apologists are saying, we're in line with that revelation. Okay, and even you have touched on it a little bit, guys. Good job. We can only know that the great philosophers of Middle Platonism are going to have to give answer. Right. And that they gave answer means that these kinds of arguments that the apologists are making must have had their effect. Because the likes of Celsus, Porphyry, Plotinus will all have to address Christianity. And so I think that brings us maybe to our takeaways for the apologists.
Yeah, we basically moved from the reaction to Paul, which is a sneer, and we'll hear about this stuff next time, to writing full out like responses to Christianity.
Full books responses.
There's a reason why we don't have a massive like 5-book response to the cult of Mithra, but we do have it like in droves, as responses to Christianity, and it's because of the work that these apologists did. So they succeeded. They succeeded in the goal of penetrating the philosophical class of Greco-Roman society and stimulating the conversation so that Christianity can now engage as peers rather than as like some foreign superstition that was coming and talking about resurrected bodies.
Right. And so in general, like they take Christianity really into a higher intellectual plane, right? Christianity is a religion that honors reason. Actually, it's a religion that worships reason. And therefore, there's no fear in seeking truth always. Right. That it's almost freeing. The apologists have almost freed us, right? There's no fear in seeking truth. And so it's that kind of free spirit that will allow Christians to really be the heirs of all classical wisdom. And it'll allow, in fact, Christendom the freedom to make all the cultural, philosophical advancements that they will go on to make throughout the Middle Ages into the Renaissance and beyond. It actually begins here with the apologists.
Well, we at this time there's about 40,000 Christians in the empire.
So 2nd century. Yeah, you're right.
So we go from about 40,000 here to, if I remember Stark correctly,
that's the best guess.
Yeah, the best guess is
the best.
By the time you get
the best guess is about 40.
By the time you get to the 400s, or no, the 4th century, you're talking 6 million. That's what I got.
Yeah. By the year 200, we're going to be upwards of over 200,000.
Yeah.
Right. So
take that. So just a span of 70 years, roundabouts, you go from 40,000 to 200,000 Christians. Now, people like the apologists, you can't underestimate how much they played a role in that. And I actually want to end this episode just talking a little bit about the martyrdom of Justin. We call him Justin Martyr for a reason, right? You can't understate how profound the image of Socrates' martyrdom was to the Greco-Roman society, especially this class of people. The way that Socrates died was the greatest of his philosophical acts. So when Socrates is debating in, Plato's Socrates, when he's debating, he's postulating questions. He doesn't even have all the answers necessarily. He's using the Socratic, what we call now the Socratic method. Like, well, what do you think of that? Why do you think this? Like he's open to truth. He's going, wherever truth is going. But ultimately, what makes Socrates a philosopher was the way that he died. That he was unjustly put to death, and that he received that death in complete peace. And here you have all these philosophers like a Galen, or later like a Porphyry, or all these folks like saying that Christianity is a superstition of women and children and it's nonsense and all this kind of stuff. Yet, time and time again, we also see in the sources descriptions of how these Christians are dying. And how the crowds
dying as philosophers,
and how the crowds are impressed with them. And in Justin, I feel like we have the pinnacle of this, because here's a man who's wearing the philosopher's garb and dying unjustly and refusing to give answer to these ridiculous charges that are coming against him.
It wouldn't have been lost on the Romans. No. Looking at Justin the philosopher, they immediately would have seen Socrates. Yes. They would have immediately related to what's happening in that arena with Justin. And it's super moving too. Like these are human beings that we're talking about again, right? Human beings that just didn't have ideas, but again, a mode of life that they lived and died for, right? So it's kind of powerful. In the beginning of Justin's first apology that he addresses to Antoninus Pius, the emperor, he says this. He says, "For we have come not to flatter you by this writing, nor please you by our address, but to beg that you pass judgment, after an accurate and searching investigation, not flattered by prejudice or by a desire of pleasing superstitious men, nor induced by a rational impulse or evil rumors which have long been prevalent, to give a decision which will prove to be against yourselves. For as for us, we reckon that no evil can be done us, unless we be convicted as evildoers, or proved to be wicked men. And you can kill us, but you can't hurt us." Like, that's how he opens his apology. You can kill me. And then to see him go through his life and end up in the arena before the prefect. And the prefect, Rusticus, says, "Where do you assemble?" Justin says to the prefect, "Where each one chooses and can. For do you fancy that we all meet in the very same place? Not so, because the God of the Christians is not circumscribed by place, but being invisible fills the heaven and the earth, and everywhere is worshipped and glorified by the faithful." Rusticus the prefect said, "Tell me where you assemble, or into what place do you collect your followers?" Justin said, "I live above one Martinus, at the baths, and during the whole time I am unaware of any other meeting than this. And if anyone wished to come to me, I communicated to him the doctrines of truth." Rusticus said, "Are you not then a Christian?" Justin said, "Yes, I am a Christian." Now, I'll pause there. Justin opens his apology by saying, don't just judge us for being a Christian, actually find out if we're evildoers. And here we see him after his apology, right? He goes, explains the faith, right, to the emperor. All this. Still, it doesn't stop the sporadic persecution of Christians. The prefect says, "Are you a Christian?" Well, then guess what? You're getting the axe, right? Literally, quite literally. So then it goes on to say, Rusticus goes on to the other Christians. Every Christian starts to reply, "Yes, I am a Christian. Yes, I am a Christian. Christianum sum, Christianum sum." The prefect says to Justin, "Hearken, you who are called learned, and think that you know true doctrines. If you are scourged and beheaded, do you believe you will ascend into heaven?" Justin said, "I hope that, if I endure these things, I shall have his gifts, for I know that to all who have thus lived, there abides the divine favor until the completion of the whole world." Rusticus the prefect said, "Do you suppose, then, that you will ascend into heaven to receive some recompense?" Justin said, "I do not suppose it, but I know and am fully persuaded of it." Rusticus the prefect said, "Let us then now come to the matter at hand, and which presses. Having come together, offer sacrifice with one accord to the gods." Justin said, "No right-thinking person falls away from piety to impiety." Rusticus the prefect said, "Unless you obey, you shall be mercilessly punished." Justin said, "Through prayer we can be saved on account of our Lord Jesus Christ, even when we have been punished, because this shall become to us salvation and confidence at the more fearful and universal judgment seat of our Lord and Savior." Thus also said the other martyrs, "Do what you will, for we are Christians, and we do not sacrifice to idols." Rusticus the prefect pronounced the sentence, saying, "Let those who have refused to sacrifice to the gods and to yield to the command of the emperor be scourged, led away to suffer the punishment of decapitation according to the laws." And then the account ends, "The holy martyrs, having glorified God, having gone forth to the accustomed place, were beheaded, and perfected their testimony in the confession of the Savior. And some of the faithful, having secretly removed their bodies, laid them in a suitable place, the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ having wrought along with them, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen."
So you can see there the they weren't satisfied with just the I'm a Christian. It's not like they said I'm a Christian, okay, then behead him. It was I'm a Christian, okay, but sacrifice to the gods. And then they say no, I'm not going to move from piety to impiety, right? So it's the contumacious, it's the contumatia that we talked about with Pliny. That's the precedent. So Pliny's precedent is what did it. Is that he was obstinate in the face of the request to sacrifice. But it's a very moving account because, like I said before, with this class of Christian at the time, their goal as philosophers was the blessed life, and for them the pinnacle of that was Socrates' death. And Justin Martyr stands out among the guys that we've talked about because, Tatian, like we said, one of his pupils sadly ends up forming some sect that is eventually is not accepted by the church. But Justin, his journey begins on a beach, like with an old man, who, after Justin had gone through all of these different schools, he talks about this in his is it the Dialogue of Trypho? Yeah, beginning of Dialogue of Trypho. Yeah. Go read that, everyone. Like, go read his just how he went to each school of philosophy and practiced the life to see if it was the blessed life, and it wasn't. But then he meets this old man who reveals to him Christianity, and Justin lives that life and comes to know that this is it. This is the blessed life. Yeah. And for him, like for us, like our salvation would be like, I die a peaceful death around my family, and say, I love you. I die and I go to heaven. His was this exact moment to be Socrates, like in the arena, like right in front, right in a trial where he's being judged unjustly, wearing the philosopher's garb and answering back as a man and saying, I will not be impious. I will maintain my piety and the convictions of what I stand for.
It was only more proof. The more the Romans pressed him, it was only more proof that he was in the right.
So that blessedness that he was trying to attain to all his life, that started way back on that beach as a young man, we can say that he fully attained to the blessedness that he was seeking.